Tom Brady, the quarterback of the Buccaneers now, has been labeled as the GOAT, the greatest of all time when it comes to NFL. He's got like 7 Super Bowl rings, 5-time MVP, set numerous records, and so people really look up to him. Well, one day he was sitting down after his 3rd Super Bowl and had an interview with Steve Croft of 60 Minutes. That in spite of all his money, achievements, and fame, there was still this emptiness, and he felt puzzled. This is what he said, quote, "A lot of times I think I get very frustrated and introverted, and there's times where I'm not the person I want to be. Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me? I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life. Me, I think there's got to be more to this than this. I mean, this can't be what it's all cracked up to be," unquote. And Steve Croft went on to ask Brady, so what's the answer? And Brady replied, I wish I knew. 10 years later, Brady was asked the same question and admitted he still hadn't found the answer. Well, it doesn't cost you anything, but I'll tell you, the Bible does have the answer. And the Bible tells us that we were made for a relationship with God. And you will find that peace and that purpose not apart from God, but in a relationship with Him. King Solomon has written this book of Ecclesiastes from the eyes of an unsaved man, trying to find meaning and purpose in life. And his discovery is only finding how empty life is. That ultimately, it's only when we set our eyes and look up to the Lord that we find peace and meaning and purpose in life. And hopefully you have done that. But in this teachers of this book, his view of things is he's trying all kinds of things. We closed in chapter 1 where he was looking at education and philosophy. Is that where I can find meaning and purpose? And of course, now in chapter 2, he's going to try everything underneath the sun. From partying to a workaholic, to building things and materialism. At every turn, he comes to this same conclusion over and over, that you can have it all and yet feel absolutely empty inside. And that may be where you're at today. Maybe you're watching online and that's where you're at today. It's often the case where God will bring us to see our emptiness first before we respond to His fullness. He's given you Christ. He's giving you everything you need for life and godliness found in Jesus Christ. And until you come into that relationship with Him, you'll just end up going around and round and round, trying to find meaning and purpose in everything in this life. But let's dive into this. Chapter 2, verse 1. He goes on and says, "Then I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish?" So the first thing, if you're taking notes, you might note is he looks at pleasure. He looks at hedonism, which is maximum pleasure and minimum pain. This is the thrill-seeking type of attitude. This is the one who is just it's the YOLO era of, you only live once, and so get the gusto. Hey, what you were meant for is to travel the world, get all the experience that you can, and have fun. The story is told of a man who went into a travel agency and said, basically, hey, I'm looking to go somewhere, and the agent pulled out a map of the world and gave it to him and said, well, where do you want to go? And he looked at it from all different angles, and he finally just said to him, is this all you have to offer? It's the whole world. It's all the world can offer. And yet some people, instead of looking at the outside things to experience, they look at that aspect of laughter that he talks about, or comedy in verse 2, and his conclusion was, it's madness, it's madness. And we've seen comedians that often is the case, they suffer great internal depression and pain. I mean, you remember Robin Williams, and all of a sudden things come out and you're like, wow, comedy masks it all. there's an emptiness in life, and people just want to laugh their way through it, to forget about it. And so look at verse 3. Then he turns to partying, and he says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their life. And so he says, in a sense, let's try alcohol. And he says, man, I only played the fool. It was folly. And often you find in life that, and maybe you've experienced this, that alcohol is simply that escape from the pains and the pressure of life, the stresses of life. People say, I got to get away from this, I need a relief, and so why not? And then they find out that it only makes things worse. Often it affects relationships, it affects attitudes, it affects work ethic. It really starts to eat you up physically as well as emotionally, mentally, in every way. And maybe you found that to be true. The emptiness of partying and drinking and the drugs. And man, you have a thrill for a moment, but eventually it kicks back and you go, this is it? My older brother made a tract one time. He's an incredible artist, and he made a tract. Evangelistic tract is basically how to get saved. It was called The Search for True Satisfaction, and it was kind of this story comic book of this kid who tries everything from concert to drugs to everything, trying to fulfill his life until finally he comes to know Christ. My brother took this tract and used to go down to Central Avenue. How many of you guys cruised Central Avenue back in the day? Okay. If you were in my era. That's what we did. Go down there and cruise. But he started handing out these tracts down at Central Avenue. At one point, there was a red light, and he goes out into the streets, into car windows, and throwing these tracts into people's windows, and he got a ticket. A cop pulled him over, gave him a ticket. Now, how do you explain, what do you do as a parent when your kid gets a ticket for sharing the gospel? I mean, at that point, I think my parents just went, hey, way to go, dude. So anyways, but he was handing out these tracts, The Search for True Satisfaction. And about a year, on the back of the tract was this, hey, if you'd like to get to know Jesus, give me a call, and had his number. About a year, maybe a year and a half later, all of a sudden he gets this call on the phone from this guy. Hey, is this Micah? And he says, yeah, what's up? He says, man, I was cleaning out my dresser. I was cleaning out my clothes, and I came across this tract that you made. A night a long time ago, I must have just shoved it in my pocket and never wore those pants again and shoved them in the back of my dresser. And I'm cleaning it out, and I'm realizing now the emptiness of my own life. I need Jesus. What do I need to do? What a cool thing. That God can take those little things that you've planted and use them years and years down the road. But we've all been there at times. We're seeking things to fulfill our life only to find out it's empty. And Solomon says here, the partying, the pleasures didn't work. And so look where he turns to in verse 4. He now turns to possessions and projects. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I'd made myself gardens and orchards and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I mean, he built mansions and vineyards and gardens and parks. He's got water parks galore, you might say fancy irrigations and fountains. He was a master gardener, a landscaper, a farmer, an architect. And when you look in the scriptures at all he built, it's absolutely amazing. He built the temple for the Lord. And we talked about it last week. The value of that is in the trillions of dollars. It took him 7 years to build the temple. And then after he finished the temple, he built his own palace, which took another 13 years to build. Incredible, sparing no expense. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. It says there in 1 Kings 7. It was 45 pillars made out of cedar wood from Lebanon. He built the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of Judgment, where he had a court and a throne. I mean, the Trump Towers, Carnegie Hall, nothing in comparison to what King Solomon was trumpeting out. Okay, that's what I meant to say. He built these things, and then he had incredible gardens. You can go to Jerusalem and you can see the king's garden that he established there. In 1 Kings 4:26, he had 40,000 horse stalls. 40,000. He's not Stalin. He's not horsing around. You gonna throw that one in there? I mean, 40,000 horse stalls? You can go to today and you can go to Israel in the area of Megiddo and see the ruins of those stalls there. The guy was amazing. Up north in Hermon, north of Galilee, the Song of Solomon refers to a wonderful park with trees and gardens and fruits there. And all of this happened, all of these projects, and yet he's still empty inside. In 2016, a U.S. study found architects fifth on the list of jobs of people who commit suicide. 32.2 per 100,000. At the top of the list, farming, fishing, and forestry. 84.5 per 100,000. In other words, the reality says that the projects and the products don't fill the emptiness in life. Only Jesus can. So look at verse 7. So now he turns to positions. I acquired male and female servants, and I had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. And so Solomon had slaves. It was common in that era. They were even born into his household. And he had people working for him from other nations that cared for all of his flocks and all of his herds. I mean, this guy was looked up to. He was respected. You who know your Bible remember that the Queen of Sheba even went from her hometown, traveled all the way to Jerusalem just to see that these things were so. And she was amazed at his wisdom and everything that he had. He had positions of power. But then he also had prizes. He says, I also gathered for myself, verse 8, silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. And you think about that, he had these things. It's been said that his net worth, King Solomon's net worth, was $2.6 trillion. I want you to give you a perspective. That perspective would be if you got $2 million per day for 30 years. That's a lot of money. And here is what he is saying. And yet with all this power, all these possessions, all these positions, he's still empty inside. Interesting. There was a study of the Natural Human Behavior Journal concluded actually that the richer we are, that the more unhappy we get. Why? Because more money equals more wants. We're always chasing the next big thing. More money equals more isolation. We distance ourselves wondering who our true friends are or who are those who are only in it because we have money, leading to depression. More money equals more work, more stress at the job, more time demands, and becoming workaholics. And it really is this downward spiral that takes place. And they posted in this article that the key to the happiness drive is not more money, but the enjoyment of the relationships and doing the things we love to do. And I want to say, duh, save yourself some money and read Ecclesiastes. That's exactly what it's talking about 3,000 years ago. And even that approach of just, well, I'm just going to cultivate my relationships and be content is still missing the key element, and that is the relationship with God. You know, Jesus said it in Matthew 22 when someone asked him, what's the greatest commandment? He said in Matthew 22, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. It was as if he said, you want to find your meaning and purpose in life? Start with God, your relationship with God. How is that going? And on that is going to also stem out how you're going to treat others. And so we always go back to that root, that source. And yet man hasn't. We've ignored God's word. We've done things our own way. We continually spin around trying to find peace and life in everything around us. One of the articles I read said that CEOs are more than double the risk of depression than the general public. CEOs. It's weird because we think those who are set for life would never have any problems, have some of the greatest problems in life. You remember the story Jesus told? There was a rich young ruler who came to him one day. And he said, good teacher, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus told him, you need to obey the commandments. You need to do those things. And he said to him, I've done all these things from my youth, but something is still missing. something is still missing. And he told him, I want you to go and sell off everything you have and give to the poor and then come follow me. It's as if he said, these things have become idols in your life. That's what you're trying to find life in, the things I never meant you to find life in. And you need to get them off the throne of your heart and put God back in the right place. Follow me. And the man went away sorrowful, it says, because he had great possessions. The possessions possessed him. Bad case to be. And yet, what do we hear from the world? More stuff equals more happiness. No. Jesus said in Luke 12, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Don't try to find your purpose and meaning in what you own. So Solomon tried pleasures, partying, possessions, positions of power, and money. And look at verse 8, the second half. He says, I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So, hey, I got the best concerts Israel can put out. I've got all the instruments you could have. The Museum of Musical Instrument over there, nothing compared to what Solomon's got. I've got instruments I've made up, and he's got all these things. And he's still finding this emptiness. We know he also had 700 concubines and 300 wives, so he definitely was one who in people tried to find satisfaction, even in the sexual relationships. And he says there, I had everything a man could want. And still, it's empty. This outlook is coming from a firsthand experience. Remember that. This is not somebody who's just watching from afar others who are not like him. It's the guy who was at the top of the ladder, the very, very tip top, and says it's all empty. Warren Wiersbe said this, enjoyment without God is only entertainment, not enrichment. You cannot live on entertainment. How true that is. Look at verse 9. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. So though greater than others, he remained clear in his head. He's in this test time. As if he's watching himself, he's observing, and he's at that place going, there's nothing more. There's nothing that's going to fulfill. It was Alexander the Great at 33 years old who stood and wept before all his men because he believed there was no more worlds to conquer. I mean, that's a unique place. And yet we think somehow, well, it'll be different for me. It's not. The last thing he turns to is the progress of work. In verse 11, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on all the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity or emptiness and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. It's not bad to work hard. We have to understand that. God, when he made Adam in the garden, he gave him a job to do, even before Eve came along. I think that's why men like to work more than they like relationships, honestly. We're task-oriented because we can blame Adam. That's what he did before Eve came. And so God wants you to work, and he named the animals, he tended the garden, and it became an act of worship to the Lord. It wasn't the work that he was designed and created for only. He was created for that relationship with God. But how many have said, well, let's get God out of the picture and I'm just going to work. I am a workaholic. And so I work day after day, hour after hour, year after year. You know, vacations are for the week and I'm just going to work. And they work hard and they find ultimately that it's like chasing the wind. It's disappointing. It's frustrating. You end up with the 3 S's for sure. Stuff, status, and stress. And yet, at some point, we realize how easily all our efforts of work can get blown away. You know, you put in the years at your job and you worked hard and you've kind of climbed the ladder and you get to that point and you ultimately realize that, well, you know what? If I left here, they'd simply just replace me with someone else. Meaningless. So goes life. It's like chasing the wind. Solomon has tried everything in life. And now he turns in verse 12 in comparing wisdom and folly. Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I said that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? And I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. So there is he says, there's some benefit to being wise in life. I mean, it probably will keep you from falling into pits and problems and such. As he says in verse 14, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. But then in the end, he says, the wise man and the fool, they both die the same death. They can't get away from it. And if death is inevitable for all of us, then what's the point in trying to be wise over being a fool? It's kind of that ugh moment that we talked about. He's seeing the meaningless of it. The grave has no preference among men. And though that may be true as we look at things from the natural eyes, the believer all of a sudden starts to look at death differently. Death is simply the transition from this life into the presence of God. We believe in one who has conquered death. So death may hold me physically, but it doesn't hold me forever. Jesus Christ has conquered death and made a way for me to have hope and for me to have eternity and life everlasting. It's a different perspective. But those who don't have Christ can easily look at this and go, yep, what's the point in life? If all I do is live and die. And here in verse 17, we see his frustration. Therefore, I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all his vanity and grasping for the wind. He hates life. Everything is irrational. Everything is meaningless. It's like chasing the wind. He only, even when he looks ahead, he says, it's distressing to face these things. Verse 18, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart to despair of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. And this also is vanity and a great evil. For what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. Yeesh, depressing. Some of you are like, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to walk in tomorrow and say, it's all vanity. And the reality is you can't take things with you. There's no hitch on the hearse for a U-Haul trailer. And what happens is you work so hard and you realize you're going to leave it all to others. And that's an incredible risk, because you don't know if they're going to destroy the business that you sacrifice so much for. You don't know if your kids are going to waste all that you saved and tried to make it better for them. You have no idea. They may make it better. They may make it worse. And that's what he's looking at. There's no guarantees. It's an ugh moment. And here's the reality. 1 Kings 12, it tells us Solomon's son, whose name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam came after Solomon. And Rehoboam was filled with pride. And in his arrogance, the whole kingdom was divided in two, a northern and a southern. And Israel went back to idol worship. Solomon, in a sense, could go, man, I worked so hard. I did all these things. And guess what, boy, kid? You just destroy the whole thing? And the people just scatter in 40 years? Really? That's a tough one. That's a hard pill to swallow. Doesn't take long to ruin all you built up. And people say, well, why if life is like this, then why try? Because listen, God has more in store for you than what you can see. And that's what we're living for. A couple of verses just to encourage you. 1 Corinthians 2:9. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, the things that God has prepared for those who love him. That's what we're shooting for. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my beloved brethren and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. 1 John 2:17. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. You want to gain God's perspective and plan. You want to live for his will and find out that your work will be rewarded, an eternal reward in heaven to come. And he says there in verse 20, it says, if Solomon realizes this grave reality, and it says he turned his heart and despaired. It's like he says, I need a mental health day. This is getting too much for my brain. Maybe you've been there. And then look at his experience, his conclusion of it in verse 23. All his days are sorrowful, his work burdensome. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest in its vanity. It says, I worked so hard all my life to find 3 friends knocking at my door. First, there is pain. My body aches, it hurts, my back doesn't operate the same, and life is just hurting me. I find pain. Secondly, I find grief. The people problems are so burdensome. People are always complaining. You ever find, I've lived long enough to recognize this. People are getting more mean as the days go on. I was out having ice cream with my daughter the other day, and she was telling me about stuff that was happening at work, and I'm going, wow, it's getting worse. A grief. And then he says sleeplessness. Maybe you've been there. You work so hard for things only to find that at night it keeps you up thinking about them. Anxiety robs rest. The to-do list. And Solomon says, my days are joyless and my nights are restless. It's just ugh, once again. Verse 24. Nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can enjoyment more than I? He's looking at it. In that place, it's as if he throws his hands and says, there's nothing I can do. I can't stop death. I can't stop time. It's not on my side. You know, all these factors are there. And so I'm just going to enjoy my meals and my family, and I'm going to do the work that's before me. And you realize this. Even the unsaved can see this in life. They can see these things. And believer, you need to have a greater view than just this in life. Because sometimes out of all the stresses and all the trials and all the issues we're facing, we can kind of just say, I just want to throw in the towel and I just want to eat my TV dinner and close my doors and not have any interaction with anybody and just someday die. You know, I'll just have a super simple life. But here's the problem with that. Those who settle for this outlook are missing out on what God has for them, which is greater than just this. This is the view that says it's so hard, it's so depressing that I'll just enclose myself and not have any contact with others because I'm afraid of the pain and the problems and all that stuff. But the believer says, you know, life is going to have pain, it's going to have the problems, it's going to have all those things involved, and I've got hope because of Jesus. And so I can be a light in this world, and I can be salt in this earth, and I can be effective for his kingdom in spite of all those things because he wants to use my life. Those who settle with this outlook of life are missing out on the greater blessing, life as God intended. And secondly, those who settle here with this outlook in life often end up with a bitter heart. Maybe you know people, they're just bitter. The more you isolate and introspect and shut out society and, you know, you're fearful of problems, guess what happens in your heart over time? You get bitter. You get bitter at the world because it's not the way you want it. You get bitter at people because they're all mean. You get bitter at situations that didn't turn out right. You're just a bitter person. And who wants to be known as Bitter Betty? If your name's Betty, I'm not picking on you. Who wants to be known as Bitter Betty at the end of their life? No one does. So to keep yourself from getting there, turn here. Say, Lord, you're not done with me. I want to enjoy you and have contentment in you, but I want to be effective in the world that you've put me in. And people matter. You love people. And help me to love people the right way too. Closing up here, verse 26. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. And so he's stewing and trying to make sense of all these things in life and these cycles. And if it's one last thought regarding work and wealth, and he says, God is the one that gives out blessings. So even the wretched man, a wretched, wicked man can get rich somehow through his hard work or through an inheritance, but God is still just in the end. He's the governor of the whole world, you might say. And he enforces a law of retribution that in the end everything is set right. But it doesn't, he says, it doesn't matter because you never know if the one coming after you is going to be godly or wicked. And he says it's kind of just a vain thing in life. We don't want to build a doctrine on this fact that, that he gives the work of gathering and collecting to sinners and that he gives the rich a good life. We don't want to build a doctrine on that. He's observing some things. Maybe they were in his day at times, but we have to be careful that we begin to associate riches with godliness because wicked people get rich too. And the godly aren't always resorted to just gathering and collecting. It's just an observation in life. But he says this is grasping for the wind. Let me close with this. Have you come to the same conclusion that Solomon has about life? Listen, life is only found in Jesus Christ, not apart from him. You can try the people, relationships, you can try the possessions, you can try the pleasures, you can find the positions of power, you can find all these things that Solomon tried. And I guarantee you, you'll come to the same conclusion if you haven't already. Written 3,000 years ago by the guy on the top tier, the top of the ladder, the greatest of all time, the goat of goats, and he's saying it's all empty. Well, but you're not me. You're not living in my era. You're not experiencing it'll be different for me. No, it won't. No, it won't. How do I know? Because you're no different than anybody else in this earth. You ask your neighbor, you ask your friend, you ask your parents, you ask anybody else, they will come to the same conclusion. It doesn't take a rocket science to discover this, the emptiness of life. And life is only found when we surrender to Jesus Christ. And maybe you're in that place where you're like Solomon described, you're just chasing after the wind. It's a poetic way of saying you're just running all over the place trying to find fulfillment. And let me encourage you with this. God doesn't want you to chase after the wind. He wants you to chase after the sun, not the S-U-N, the S-O-N. And in Psalms 42, David wrote, and he said, as a deer pants for the water brook, so pants my soul for you, O God. You're the one I'm pursuing, Lord. I'm thirsting for you, ultimately. You made me, and you want to fill me. You want that relationship. And when we come to that place of surrender to Jesus Christ and say, Lord, be Lord of my life, that is when we find not only contentment, peace, rest from the war, from the strife and the struggle, the war you have with God, ultimately, is when we lift up that white flag and say, Lord, I surrender to you. I believe that you died on the cross for my sins. You rose again to give me new life. It's then I find meaning and purpose. And then life begins to explode into the beauty and the wonder of all God wants to do in you, through you, and into eternity. Do you have meaning and purpose in your life? Hopefully it's not found in anything else except God and what he's given. Let's pray.